intense. To be with real people. Yeah, that's right.
This is the first effect. Are we live?
We are live.
It is all right. Well, I'm Sergio Grace. I'm the co-director of the Psychoanalytic Studies program, which is sponsoring today's event. Welcome, everyone. This return to live interaction. We're also, I think, going off to significant audience through Zoom. We are delighted to welcome here Elissa Marder from Emory University and our own office Coelen. We will do the introductions and be the respondents. I will sit down and enjoy it.
Thank you, Stavis. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here, which it feels like an event of sorts.
It does. It does.
Because it's the first time we meet again after 2.5 years, but I think it's the first time for several of us to meet in a room and have something that was very unusual to us. It seems a bit strange to do again. I'm happy that you came, Elissa. It's a pleasure. Elissa Marder and myself, we are part of an institution, a loose institution called the Society, International Society of Psychoanalysis and Philosophy. It's in this context that we met.
Or the Société Internationale de Philosophie et Psychanalyse. It's a bilingual.
It has 2 names and many languages, several languages.
That's true.
And in this context, I must say I have learned a lot from you over the years, and I think she's my main interlocutor when it comes to psychoanalysis and its link to the humanities. And in that combination, she's also part of what we just discussed, the chatting beforehand, part of a model, which is the Psychoanalytic Studies program at Emory University. That's its name, no? It's the same, it's the same name. So also this entity that rigorously does research into the thinking and practice of psychoanalysis insofar as it's a cultural practice, not as a clinical practice, but certainly in conjunction with clinical experience. And it gives psychoanalysis its fragile, marginal, proper place in the institution. And this is fostered, made possible through her work as well, which, let's say this again, where for me she's a model of how to combine the virtue of close reading, conceptual rigor, and creativity, and the attention to cultural events, shifts, and categories. And I would like to underline in particular one book that I find is a very important book, The Mother in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, 2012, so 10 years ago, published by Freudian University Press, Psychoanalysis, Photography, Deconstruction. So today, we move from reproduction to destruction, and for a year, I've been announcing your talk in my class as saying, this is the thing that psychoanalysis has to start thinking more and more about, not to save itself, not to save anything, but because it seems to be its task to renew the question of why destruction, why war, but also why war on ourselves, why war on the natural resources, which is a psychological conundrum. The answers for it are not easy to be given. There are many political reasons for it and economic reasons, but there's something that seems to beg the question of the drive, psychoanalysis, psychic constructions, the vicissitudes of civilization. So I think this is extremely important, and I'm happy that we start the conversation.
Thank you so much, Marcus. And Thank you for the invitation. Thanks to Marcus for the invitation, to Status, to the Psychoanalytic Studies program, to Sarah Monks also for the administrative help. And it's really an honor and a pleasure and a strange experience to be here. I have to remember how to do this after so long. And I'm just going to say a couple of words about this talk, which came about in a strange way. As Marcus was just saying, we're participants, I think, of a number of different organizations, and one is the SEEK that Marcus was talking about, and the other is a group of clinically affiliated people in New York called Das Unbehagen, and you may know that. And several members of Das Unbehagen last year, I went to an event and was mouthing off in the Q&A at that event about climate change. And as sometimes happened, somebody, Patricia Jarovicki, took my sort of extemporaneous comments and said, well, if you have so much to say, I'm going to invite you to talk about this. So it was really because of Patricia's invitation that I started. And I first worked, the first version of the paper that you're going to hear, I wrote a year ago. And I'm pretty interested, as I'll talk about what's changed in the last year. And I say all of this because the paper that you're going to hear, it's been sitting for a year. I consider it preliminary thoughts, and I'm really interested in starting a conversation with Marcus, but also with you all, with anybody who wants to have a conversation. So I feel like I'm at the beginning of a process rather than at the end of the process. And I also want to say that I know that like basically everyone in the world is thinking about these things. So I'm not pretending that like, oh, gee, I've had these ideas and they're all my ideas. I kind of don't know that there would be anybody who hasn't been thinking about them. So I'll just offer this as a way to start a conversation. And the title of the paper is The Shadow of the Eco, Denial and Climate Change. And I'm sort of assuming that most people would get the reference there, which is a play on a famous line from Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, where Freud says, the shadow of the object falls on the ego. And he was talking about that. So that's some background. And I'm going to, I also should say this paper's not very long, which is kind of nice, so we can have a robust conversation and lots of Q&A. There's an epigraph from Jacques Derrida, and here's the epigraph. We're talking about a trauma, and thus an event, whose temporality proceeds neither from the now that is present, nor from the present that is past, but from an impresentable to come, avenir. A weapon wounds and leaves forever open an unconscious scar. But this weapon is terrifying because it comes from the to come, from the future, a future so radically to come that it resists even the grammar of the future anterior. So that's the epigraph. On February 28th, 2022, as news of the Russian invasion of Ukraine jolted the world to attention, another story was also billed as breaking news. As reported by the New York Times, in a new report issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 270 researchers from 67 countries condemned failure of leadership on the part of the world's largest polluters, provided overwhelming evidence of systemic climate injustice, and concluded, as the headline of the article succinctly put it, quote, that climate change is harming the planet faster than we can adapt, unquote. The following week, there was a news item reporting that the Amazon rainforest has now suffered irrevocable destruction, and another news item explaining that the dramatic decrease in the population of insects threatens agriculture and the entire food chain. For the purposes of this discussion, I want to call attention to the weirdness of the fact that these starkly dire conclusions about the fate of the planet and all of its living creatures are presented both as something new and as events that are comparable to other news stories. These news items move in and out of the news feed on any given day as they are displaced and subsumed by other apparently equally pressing and urgent matters. But is the announcement that the planet is becoming catastrophically damaged and potentially uninhabitable faster than we can adapt to it on the same order of reality as every other event? I begin with this news story because it encapsulates how much and how little has changed since I wrote the first version of this essay a year ago. And let me say from the start that I support climate activism and I am ready to embrace a radical, progressive political solution to this crisis. And I'm saying that because I'm not going to be talking about the politics, but I really don't want, we can talk more about this later, but I don't want what I'm saying to be heard as if I don't understand that there is a very pressing political dimension to the issue, but that's not what I'm going to be talking about. So let me add too that I have no expertise in climate science. The reflections about denial and climate change that follow were motivated by a very specific question. How can psychoanalysis help us think about the way psychic processes are inscribed and enmeshed in this global political crisis at every level? There is, I felt, something about the radical unthinkability of climate change that puts excessive demands on the psyche itself. The incalculable scale and speed of the catastrophic destruction underway calls for a reconsideration of that unthinkability and of the force and quality of the denial that accompanies it. And unlike most other modes of knowledge, psychoanalysis does not take the subject's relation to external reality as a given. On the contrary, and this is one of the main points of the paper, on the contrary, denial of reality is not something that befalls an already constituted subject. It is a condition of possibility of the formation of the subject. There is no reality principle in the primary processes. Reality is hard-won and fragile. It emerges as a construction. It is a tenuous product of a process that Freud famously refers to as reality testing. Current changes to the external world undermine the possibility of reality testing. We are no longer engaged in testing reality. Reality is now testing us. And if, to paraphrase the language of the New York Times, the external world is changing faster than our capacity to adapt, reality itself is not what it used to be, nor, I might add, is denial. And over the past year since I first wrote this paper, it seems to me that there's been a massive shift in public discourses about climate change and climate change denial. Until very recently, climate change operated like a constant murmur. More recently, however, it has moved from the periphery of everyday discourse to the absolute center. No longer a murmur, references to climate change are now ubiquitous. They punctuate every consequential collective conversation and resurface in every communicative medium. Where there was once a murmur, there is now a shriek and a scream. Nevertheless, as in the parodic film Don't Look Up, it would seem that speaking about the disaster has had little effect on weakening the denial of the disaster or on hastening collective action to counteract it. And I fear that the essay that I wrote last year is already woefully outdated. And if that's true, which it may be, and we can talk about that, that very fact is itself worthy of reflection and discussion. So in Thoughts for the Times on War and Death, a short work written as a response to the carnage and cruelty of World War I, Freud tells the following joke. Speaking to his wife, a husband says, quote, "If one of us two dies, I shall move to Paris," unquote. It's good, right? The joke is funny because it shows that when faced with even the remotest and most hypothetical prospect of his own death, the speaking I unconsciously prefers to sustain its belief in its own immortality by displacing the burden of death onto the other, even if that other is none other than his own beloved wife. Freud tells this little one-liner to illustrate his claim that, quote, "there is nothing instinctual in us which responds to a belief in death," unquote. At the level of the unconscious primary processes, not only is death something that can only happen to other people, but others only die because I wish them dead. Elaborating further on this point, Freud writes, quote, "Our unconscious does not carry out the killing. It merely thinks it and wishes it. But it would be wrong to undervalue this psychical reality as compared with factual reality. Indeed, our unconscious will murder even for trifles. Like the ancient Athenian code of Draco, it knows no other punishment for crime than death. And this has a certain consistency, for every injury to our almighty and autocratic ego is at bottom a crime of lèse-majesté." At the end of Thoughts for the Times on War and Death, Freud explains that if he insists on the murderous, autocratic, and tyrannical qualities of the primary processes, it is because not to do so could potentially lead to a potentially riskier and more catastrophic exposure to future war. In the closing passages of that work, he asserts that, quote, "in our supposedly civilized attitude towards death, we are living psychologically beyond our means," unquote. For Freud, the apparently rational expectation that we have moved beyond the aggressions associated with the primordial denial of death is itself an unrealistic and hence potentially even more dangerous act of denial. The savagery of war teaches Freud that the actions of sovereign nations, like those of individual people, are not governed by diplomacy and political rationality, but by reactive responses to pressures from the primary processes. The expectation that the power of reason can resolve political conflicts is unreasonable, Freud claims, because it is unrealistic. And therefore, Freud proposes to ward off violent consequences, further violent consequences, by taking a backward step that advocates a less aspirational, less idealized view of humanity. By stepping back, Freud aims to counter regression with regression. In lieu of the aggressive enactments associated with a regression, he seeks to enlist regression's capacity to bring us closer to the truth about the fundamental conflicts that organize people's relation to the world. Only by stepping back from the deluded belief that the actions of sovereign European nations are actually governed by the Enlightenment moral and political values they claim to espouse, Freud says, will we be able to, quote, take the truth more into account so as to, quote, make life more tolerable for us once again. In the following lines of the essay, he writes, "To tolerate life remains, after all, the first duty of human beings, living beings," he says. "Illusion becomes valueless if it makes this harder for us," unquote. But when Freud concludes his essay with the bold maxim that, quote, "tolerating life is our first duty," he implicitly acknowledges how difficult, if not impossible, it is to perform that essential duty. Psychoanalysis tells us that even under the best of circumstances, the psyche relies on illusions and denials to survive its encounters with the world. Each individual subject forms itself by constructing an edifice of psychic reality whose very purpose is to transform life into something tolerable. But if the psyche requires illusions in times of peace and prosperity because they hide the evidence of everything that threatens its tranquility, Freud here argues that the psychic energy necessary for maintaining those illusions simply costs too much in times of war. Because war attacks the illusions that make life tolerable, the psychic cost of trying to prop up those illusions becomes unbearable. Freud thus ends up saying both that tolerating life without illusion is not possible, and that we can only do our duty to tolerate life by giving up the illusion that life is tolerable. Such is the double bind of war. And keeping these thoughts in mind, if we now turn to the psychic stresses elicited by climate change, the picture becomes even more complicated. In what follows, I would like to suggest that the complexity of the threats to the human psyche posed by climate change render it radically, inexorably unthinkable. And one of the reasons for this is that the phenomenon known as climate change is without a graspable, knowable object. The threats posed to the psyche are not reducible to anything that can be known or studied by science. Science can measure greenhouse gases, changes in the temperature of the ocean, the destruction of coral reefs, emissions, changes in weather patterns, animal extinctions, etc. And thankfully, in some cases, science can and will develop new technologies to counteract the harm done to the earth and its atmosphere. But however important and vital that knowledge and those reparative gestures might be, they do not and cannot take the measure of the impact of the real and psychic devastation that we are all already living with, whether we know it or not, and that awaits us in the future. As Jacques Derrida points out in the quotation with which I began, the temporality of trauma comes from the future. And building upon Derrida's insight, I want to suggest that the traumatic temporality of climate change unfolds as an unprogrammable future that bears within it the belated, unknowable, and incalculable effects of past actions and inactions that are indeed beyond repair. And in preparing these thoughts, I've been struggling with the fact that there's no word that adequately captures the precise dynamic entanglement of human, non-human agencies, temporal instability, incalculability, and cascading catalytic effects that I'm trying to describe. The umbrella term climate change cannot account for the colossal scale, speed, scope, range, and impact of the many interrelated and compounding consequences of the damages that have already been done and that are to come. I like the word ecocide because of its evocation of a primordial crime scene and for the way in which it conjures up a symbiotic reciprocal feedback loop whereby humans have destroyed the environmental conditions that now threaten the ongoing existence of humans. The term ecocide, which first entered into circulation in the early 1970s to describe, quote, the destruction of large areas of the natural environment as a consequence of human activity, is now proposed as a new international law. And in that law, ecocide under this proposed international law is defined as, quote, unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So this is new. This is in the last year that this has been introduced. But in making ecocide a crime, it thereby becomes something that ostensibly can be adjudicated by the law. And there is a wish also to that gesture. In so doing, it would join patricide, parricide, matricide, infanticide as delineating the anthropological contours of culture itself. And the term ecocide also insinuates that the murder of the primal other is also a form of suicide. Ecocide is always also egocide. And while this anthropocentric view of the global catastrophe has the advantage of attempting to hold humans accountable for human actions, it seems to me that it misses something essential about the crisis itself. If I ultimately choose to stick with the more prosaic term climate change, rather than its more mythopoetically evocative term ecocide, it is because ecocide implicitly posits a scenario in which the ego remains endowed with too much consistency, agency, and stability. As I see it, the term ecocide conjures up a conflict in which there is still the perceptible trace of a subject-object relation. The shadow of the ego falls too heavily over the eco. Ecocide still gives egos an object to mourn, whereas climate challenges the very subject-object relation. The word climate in the expression climate change conveys the sense of determining the very conditions of the field in which events transpire, while also remaining amorphous, unstable, fluid, and inaccessible to precise description. Climate change is a pleonasm because climate is change. The problem now for humans is that the acceleration of that change has undermined the fundamental possibility of establishing a relation to the external world, as that world has now become too unstable. The term climate has also entered the popular lexicon, and actually it was there a long time ago, but that's okay, to describe effects in systems unrelated to the ecosphere. These days, for example, one speaks about manifestations of systemic racism and sexism in terms of the climate of a given institution or place of work. The term climate thereby joins a host of other several words, such as existential threat and unprecedented, that simultaneously evoke and displace anxiety about environmental changes by transferring them into the context of political and/or social conflicts. Thus, for example, during the last election, the media used the term existential threat incessantly to describe the fears associated with the prospect that, if elected, a candidate from the opposing party would annihilate life as we know it. And while it is true that some of those fears may not have been entirely unfounded, it is nonetheless also striking that despite the fact that climate change does indeed pose a clear and present existential threat to life as we know it, the term is never or almost never used in that context. In similar fashion, the unavoidable, ubiquitous current use of the word unprecedented is itself a condensation, displacement, and denial of climate change. Whether used in the political realm or in terms of so-called natural disasters, fires, floods, etc., the term unprecedented both implicitly always disavows any knowledge of why the particular event ruptures temporal and historical continuity and attempts to restore narrative continuity by replacing that event back into a linear causal teleological narrative. Climate change, as I'm invoking it here, challenges all of those descriptive models and narrative structures. And really, this is for me one of the main points of the paper, which is that there has to be a thinking of temporality that we're kind of not equipped for. And that's what I'm groping for. And this use of the word unprecedented is, I think, both an acknowledgement and a disavowal of that issue. So the dizzying and vertiginous range of consequences resulting from climate change destabilize the interdependent interactions among virtually every system in the world, every system, by producing new configurations of contingency and causality that make the external world newly unknowable, unstable, and unmanageable. Fires and floods produce homelessness, migration, disease, famine, etc. While this was always the case, the acceleration of changes causes an increasing proliferation of variables, which then cascade into new catastrophes. So the global pandemic of the coronavirus, for example, continues to generate myriad cascading political economic sub-events. And while global pandemics could have occurred in earlier times, the likelihood of new pandemics becomes infinitely more probable, but not necessarily more manageable. And moreover, pandemics are only one possible consequence of a myriad of potential systemic collapses. And the point here is not merely that each individual event is catastrophic, but rather that the catastrophes in question pose an unbearable threat to the psyche because they are increasingly unpredictable, unknowable, and incalculable. And put another way, external reality can no longer provide an external bulwark to the psyche when the real world itself becomes ungrounded. According to Freud, time, temporality, is directly bound to the reality principle. And in destroying the very consistency of reality, climate change also unmoors temporality. And more problematically still, even if by some stroke of magic, all nation states, corporations, and individuals could be convinced to commit to collective action combating climate change tomorrow, and what a wonderful fairy tale that would be, those efforts, however urgently needed, would not, I believe, either succeed in repairing the damage that has been done to the planet or alleviate the psychic effects of that damage. The omnipresent specter of climate change and global warming cannot be processed by individual psyches, because there is little, if anything, that individual people can do as individuals to stop the devastation that hovers on the horizon. And while quotidian sanity requires that we deny the magnitude of that devastation, denial of reality only accelerates and exacerbates the very reality that it aims to deny. And following Derrida, then, climate change denial would, in this sense, be the exemplary autoimmune structure. On Transience, another short essay written during the First World War, Freud conjures up a scenario of total annihilation of life on Earth to make the point that from the perspective of the psyche, the actual prospect that the world might really come to an end does not in and of itself constitute a threat. He writes, quote, "A geological epoch may even arrive when all animate life upon the earth ceases. But since the value of all this beauty and perfection is determined only by its significance for our own emotional lives, it has no need to survive us and is therefore independent of absolute duration," unquote. In this scenario, Freud argues that we're able to contemplate the future destruction of the world without distress because that future eventuality has no reality or meaning for our present emotional life. But Freud also suggests that the capacity to remain indifferent to that doomsday vision requires that the event in question be radically external to us, beyond our control, and unrelated to any specific desires or actions that we may have taken or failed to take in the past. Later in the same essay, Freud contrasts this psychic equanimity to the melancholia exhibited by his poet friend who is unable to enjoy beauty because it is doomed to fade. For Freud, the poet's inability to take pleasure in the beauty of the present moment indicates that he is actually suffering from a pre-existing loss that was not mourned. The poet's melancholic response signals that a work of mourning has not been done. If we now turn our attention back to climate change, the threat to the psyche manifests as anxiety as well as grief and denial. And the prevalence of anxiety associated with climate change registers the traumatic return of disavowed and unmourned past losses that were not consciously registered as events as that they were occurring. And, again, this is something we can think about, sort of where did it start? Where did it go past the point where it was reparable? Like, how long ago was that? So in common parlance, the term climate change denial refers to a dominant group of conservative politicians, corporations, and industries that refuse to admit the scientific evidence that establishes the factual basis of climate change. And according to a recent New York Times information fact sheet, and this was from a year ago, about climate change, the cause for climate change denial is ideology. So they basically say it's capitalism, it's ideology, it's bad. And they describe this ideology as follows. quote, instead of negotiating over climate change policies and trying to make them more market-oriented, some political conservatives have taken the approach of blocking them by trying to undermine the science, end quote. And while I want to make it clear that I am in no way defending or condoning this cynical and reprehensible capitalistic refusal to accept the reality of climate change in the interest of exploitation, greed, and profit, so I'm not on the side of the climate change denial. I am also suggesting that in this very same fact sheet, the Times, as well as most other popular current discourses about climate change, is itself not immune from climate change denial, even if that denial takes a very different form and has other consequences. And the very New York Times fact sheet that claims to give clear answers to basic questions about climate change also participates in denying reality by implying that the ongoing traumatic effects of climate change can be mitigated and overcome via scientific rationality, information sharing, and participation in existing political systems. And in response to the question, are there any realistic solution to the problem? The Times reports that, and here's what they say. Society has put off action for so long that the risks are now severe, scientists say. But it is not too late to act. The warming will slow to a potentially manageable pace only when human emissions are reduced to zero. The good news is that they are now falling in many countries as a result of programs like fuel economy standards for cars, stricter building codes, and emissions limits for power plants. But experts say that the energy transition needs to speed up drastically to head off the worst effects of climate change, end quote. So the possibility of the future that is here conjured up is depicted as attainable as long as, quote, human emissions are reduced to zero, end quote. And despite alluding to unspecified risks and rates of warming, the future is offered up like an ecstatic, homeostatic nirvana principle that can only be attained when all human emissions are reduced to zero. The dubiously realistic goal of zero emissions pervades almost all popular discussions of climate change solutions. Humans live by producing emissions, though. It's hard to imagine what human life with zero emissions would look like, or how we would arrive at that point, even if we're only talking about cars and buildings and power plants, rather than the many other ways humans consume energy and excrete waste. The optimal scenario that is proposed here, attaining the nirvana principle of zero emissions, relies upon a basic act of dissociation. The nefarious effects of one specific polluting agent, car emissions, is disengaged from its position within the entire ecosystem of human and non-human agents. The narrative that this disassociation produces is one in which nothing else in the world is happening during the time that it will take for everyone to act together so that we can reduce our collective human emissions to zero. And according to this narrative, time does not pass while we get our act together to produce zero emissions in the name of the future. There are no catastrophic events in the meantime, no other surprises, nothing that would interrupt our aim at a projected future target of zero human emissions. The image of future survival invoked here looks a lot like living death. Likewise, let's not forget that the very concept of the carbon footprint was invented by the fossil fuel industry as a way of displacing the responsibility for combating global warming onto individuals. Popular culture is full of human interest stories advocating personal responsibility for climate change. And significant swathes of particularly privileged individuals have eagerly embraced composting, recycling, alternative energy, and transportation methods as they seek to do their part to combat climate change. However laudable these individual actions may be, they are primarily ways of warding off anxiety and managing feelings of guilt and helplessness. These individual acts almost invariably also bear the mark of wealth and privilege. People with money to burn buy electric cars and invest in solar panels. The media is full of heartwarming stories of heroically meaningful acts by individual people. For example, and this is when I was writing this, on February 15th, I just opened the New York Times, is unfortunately my reference point, but on February 15th, 2021, I open up the New York Times and read the following headline: "Leftovers may be saving the planet. unquote. The author of this absurdly wishful personal essay relates that the sight of her daughter scrounging for the last sprig of parsley in the back of the vegetable drawer of her refrigerator gives her hope for the future. Buoyed by the prospect of transitioning to, quote, green chemistry, that is, restricting manufacture to producing only goods that can be broken down and destroyed, she imagines that, quote, maybe we can teach new microorganisms to love the taste of old plastic. Maybe we can before we even begin to cook. Imagine what kind of garbage we're leaving behind and make the goal be no garbage left behind at all. What kind of a narrative fantasy is this? This woman who confesses in her essay that she still eats chicken and uses plastic Tupperware, but aspires to trade in her plastic for glass, finds planetary salvation in her daughter's search for lost parsley because she imagines that it is a harbinger of an ideal world of zero emissions, a world with no leftovers, no remainders, no waste, no garbage left behind at all. And for the privileged, it seems that the future is a place where no one ever shits. Maybe we can, she says. Maybe we can the can. The poor and the disenfranchised, however, are always left in the position to clean up the shit or risk being shot out of the system as human leftovers. We don't know much about the precise suffering that we're in for, but we do know is that suffering will not be borne equally by all. The unbearable reality of climate change exposes the psyche to a primordial tear in reality itself. The inexorably real threat of climate change threatens the psyche's ability to establish a rational relation to reality. There is no merely sane relation to climate change. It has made us crazy, and it will make us crazy. Denial is our only defense, but it is also our undoing. There is no outside to denial. There are only different forms of denial that will have different side effects and unintended consequences. And some of the most well-meaning forms of denial may turn out to be the most insidious as they attempt to rationalize, humanize, and normalize actions and events that ought to force us to reckon with what we cannot bear to know. And here I'm ambivalent about this example, but I'll throw it out there. For example, and it's not Greta herself, I admire Greta Thunberg, but it's the idolization and idealization of Greta Thunberg often reinforces fantasies of individual sovereignty. The collective fantasy that the heroic actions of a virginal teenage girl will save the world because, like Antigone, she stands up to sovereign authority by speaking truth to power might feel good, but I'm not sure exactly how the truth she embodies translates into tolerating life under climate change. And unlike other disasters and calamities that have affected humans, war, genocide, nuclear destruction, pandemics, despotism, and we can add like everything that's happened in the last year or two. Climate change presents unique challenges to the human psyche as it engages traumatic temporality on a global scale. Humans are responsible for causing damage that humans cannot repair. What is done cannot be undone. And it is this double position. We are simultaneously responsible for ongoing crimes against the primordial other, the earth, and rendered helpless by what we have done. And because it is already too late to prevent irreparable damage to the earth and to the ecosystems in which we live, the very recognition of climate tests the subject's relation to both time and reality. The super rich are planning their exit strategies like there is no tomorrow. While the rest of us starve, fight, and perish, they're planning on moving to Mars.
Elissa, thank you. Beautifully written paper. And Marcus, are you gonna make some comments?
Yeah,
And then we'll open it up for
Yeah.
questions, and also people from who are watching us on Zoom can ask questions as well.
Well, thank you very much. It's an uncanny paper. It brings a presence of something that is truly ungraspable, and in this ungraspability present, I would like to extend, and this is the question whether that is possible, you emphasize the two dimensions of climate and time. It's the, unlimiting and indetermining dimension in which the question of the subject and the object, the question of the agent, and its victim disappear. And at the same time, for the sake of the representation of the argument, you still against which delusions, denials, and other types of defenses, of which you say there is no outside, there are versions of denial. But for which, nevertheless, and this is imposed on us by language and the way we speak and we present, you do still speak in the rhetoric of one humanity. At the same time, you say it's fundamentally split, and then we'll go to Mars and the others will not. But there still is
In anthropocentrism, is that?
I wonder about something in this, which has to do with the very Freudian notion, the notion of identification. And I wonder whether we are, because we can describe it in two extremes, whether we are in a moment of hyper-identification with ourselves. When you said, no, there's no one in the world who does not think of this at this. We behave as if we were one mass. And I think we could describe certain movements of this mass. In particular, I think linguistic movements and media supported linguistic movements in those terms in which Freud described the masses in his famous text on analysis of the ego and mass psychology, as this strange entity that behaves as if it was one organism, and has no subjectivity, but at the same time has one agency. So there's a massification of sorts, for which that smaller elements, just as an anecdote, the first qualification of the sanctions against Russia were called unprecedented sanctions. Mm. And then it was replaced, because I think someone thought replaced by sanctions as had never been before, as never. So there was some kind of awareness of the strange migration of the stupidity of this term and all in the so there is a push towards identification, a hyper identification, and on the other hand, it seems that there's a complete there is a type of dissociation in that which still we identify as us, humans, that might be of the same order as the order of the disintegration of the categories time and climate. What climate does to space is what time does to time. And this is not a question. This is a question that I have as a speculative question. Present a counter model. In 1972, Howard Searles, the British psychiatrist, wrote a paper on the same problem in relation to the psychoanalytic hypothesis is very different, much more personal, much more individual-based and drive-based and model of psyche-based. He said there must be an aggression towards the next generation, otherwise you wouldn't do this. So the idea is that there must be, there's not an ecocide, it's like an infanticide in the future, like progressive infanticide. We even kill the three generations.
No future.
And this seems correct, and at the same time, it seems not too psychological in a certain way. So I wonder about the disintegration of the category of reproduction and generation in relation to this, and how to think the coincidence of the disappearance in a material way of the question of the organism and its what it generates in medical science, the creation of organs out of tissues that are not human, the question of reproduction of the human body. This kind of disintegration, which is very material, does not follow the same logic somehow. And the companies, as if it were a side problem, the question of climate change, but is maybe a life change, or a change in what life form is, that somehow accompanies, in a way that's much more difficult to grasp and even more ghastly than the climate change, this whole process, and how one would think about that in relation to psychoanalysis and the psychoanalyst. I would have a comment on the passage in Freud where he speculates about the birth of speculation in relation to the corpse, but I mean, we can keep this for later and just keep it at that. We can open the discussion and then see where it takes us.
All of that is super interesting, and I certainly I mean, I think the problem is one of massification in different ways, and I think the problem is that there is, for all kinds of reasons, that there's an assault on the sovereign subject, like I don't think humans have seen before. So, people, not that I actually think this, but people say that the limit of psychoanalysis is that it's a theory of individuals. And I think that's not a sophisticated understanding of what psychoanalysis is, because the unconscious is, politically and historically embedded as far as I'm concerned. So I actually have never thought that it was about individuals or individual subjects. Nonetheless, certain things show up at the level of particular subjects. And I think that the massification that we're dealing with now, and I think there's another kind of life, which I had in an earlier version of this, and I've sort of lost the articulation in my own brain, but of the algorithmization of us as well. So that the fact that our life data is being taken and calculated, and activities, that we're kind of composite data entry points for all kinds of things. So that the unit of the subject is really like irrelevant for a lot of what's going on right now. And I don't know, I don't disagree with what you're I don't disagree with what you're saying about identification, or a kind of, I don't remember exactly how you put it, but a kind of hyper identification. But I guess what I'm advocating for, following Freud, and it's faute de mieux. I mean, it's really just because I don't know, I don't know how to think about this, but what I'm advocating for is like some kind of an elaboration of an articulation of a new kind of a new relation to denial, like on a parallel to what Freud was saying about World War I. He was sort of saying, we're really in for it if we keep getting surprised at how vicious we are. So we actually have to just be less aspirational. And there's something about the subject or its relation to other subjects, and even collective action. I guess that, because I was imagining, I was reading plenty of people before I came in here, and I was imagining myself being taken out, because let's say I was reading a colleague by a Marxist colleague who basically said, we have all the tools we need. We have indigenous, women-oriented collective action, and we have the Green New Deal, we have AOC, and if we just sort of go with what we have, we can handle this. And I can't, I don't want to say no to that, but I can't totally say yes to that either. So I guess I'm thinking there has to be some kind of a collectivity, and that collectivity has to involve some sort of an identification for us to move in this, because all I've laid out is an impasse, and that's kind of not good enough. In terms of the psychiatrist that you brought up about aggression toward the next generation, there's a lot of things to, I almost think that's kind of a wish, that there would be a next generation. You know, I want to, like that infanticide would be even an option, and that the love and the hate would go together. So, so I guess I think, and you know, I was doing some reading around before I came here, because there's like, people have written so many interesting things about this topic, and I haven't read them, and maybe people in the audience, either on Zoom or here, have read them. But you know, there's, I mean, maybe you know about this, that people are talking about pre-traumatic stress disorder. You know, that there's a whole movement of people thinking instead of post, because, and there is, you know, it's documented climate change. And there are also people who, I mean, I'm talking about generation. There are people who are refusing to have children all over, because that stress is too much. So, but regardless, I think we have to be thinking about new forms of life. And I do think those new forms of life are not necessarily humanoid, or that they're, because what I at least wanted to be saying, even if there was a massification, is that every single system involves cascading effects with every system. And so I don't think it's only human agents. I think human agents have done things that then affect every system, and that then affects every other system. So whether they're Gulf Stream, whether they're wind systems, whether they're seed systems, whether they're insects, whether they're, but what I'm obsessed with is the interrelatedness of those systems and those events with one another. And that was really what I wanted to scream about, was I wanted to scream about the narratives that get proposed are always like past, present, future narratives, where you don't have the kind of problem of weird causality and contingency that's entering at every point. And, you know, I mean, my middle name is Cassandra, not really, but my middle name is Cassandra, but every time I hear like the people were like, gee, it's moving faster than we thought. And I'm like, how can this be moving faster than you thought? Like, how can this possibly be? It's been moving faster than you thought for 30 years. You know, it's like, so there's something about speed here that, speed that to me even interrupts generation, or the time of life, I guess I want to say. But I'm open to all ideas, and what you're saying is super interesting, and what you're saying about massification is there. I just don't even know how to think it, like how to think. So I don't know whether I answered your.
It's very searching in my mind as well. I know it's like the two things I can say to clarify. I wonder if I look at this, it's like there's something subjective that has to be taken into account, but still something comes down to the individual, and this is where we have to somehow localize. And of course, you know, from the psychoanalytic point of view, or for the question of psychoanalysis, the tool will remain psychoanalytic work. It will remain work in transference. If otherwise, it would be other types of speculation, which are also necessary. But there still will be something, you know, manifesting on the level of the transferential experience that psychoanalysis is. But then the question is, what are the non-subjective entities that one works with conceptually and speculatively in order somehow to orient that experience, which for Freud were the infants and the primordial man and the masses.
Right.
And I wonder whether you are not introducing this necessarily with that another entity.
I'm trying to.
That, which is somehow the entity of the non-human struggling with the non-human environment somehow. Something like this.
No, that is kind of where I'm with my pseudopodia. I'm trying to get trying to reach out to that kind of a space, but I'm like groping. I don't think I've got any, I don't know where I'm.
And into which and this is, interesting that there's a different emphasis that I somehow was more expecting, but then it makes much more sense to listen to this. But I wonder where I am in this construction. Then I'm more interested in the destruction than in the denial of the effect of the destruction. I still wonder how to think the death drive in this. How to think the activity of continuing something that is of destructive order, then much more than to ask the question of how is it possible that we deny the effects of it, which of course are as destructive as the first one. So this is the.
I mean the last time I presented this paper once before, and David Lichtenstein was basically saying that I had that I was before the pleasure principle. In other words, that rather than beyond, that I was disavowing the power of the death drive, and I kind of don't know how to think it here, because I guess, and we could talk about how you think about the death drive as like whether there's some pleasure or some satisfaction, usually when the death drive is at work. I mean, that the drive, there's not satisfaction, it's beyond satisfaction, but yeah, I don't know how to think it, because the destruction is, to me, it's so colossal that I don't. I'm open to hearing what that would be. I think that in your comments, I guess après mal déluge, or just the fantasy of, or as apparently que le monde aille à sa tête, like what that the fantasy of how are you thinking of the destruction?
I think it strangely in terms of the production of. I think of it in terms of biotechnology.
In terms of what? Biotechnology. Can you say more? Can you explain?
I wonder whether the contemporaneous occurrence of the climate change denial and the
immortality, like in cloning and the fantasy of freezing and I think those two things, I totally think those two things go together. But I also think actually that the new forms of nationalism and fascism are right, and racism, are symptoms as well, not just causes and symptoms. You can have both.
Yes, but one could easily argue that human beings have been engaged in the destruction of their environments since forever. That is really how this animal works. That's
not new.
Yeah, and it's not clear whether it has anything to do with death drive or not. It's an open question. Maybe it does. Maybe the death drive is a way of trying to explain what in fact might be, I was almost going to say natural, to this particular animal. That it's an animal that, unlike other animals, seeks to destroy its environment.
But that's not even true. This, I got into this argument with David because, you know, when I remember being in 7th grade science class and being kind of horrified at ecosystems that just by the work of the ecosystem will create, like little trees will create environment where big trees will then kill the little trees. So like even.
But I'm not talking about acts of annihilation or elimination of what is other within a system. That
Right.
I'm talking about, you know, annihilating the system.
Yeah.
So including that which is vital to yourself. I mean, that's more than anything. It's a kind of, you know, kind of identified the kind of thing. But I'm wondering, first of all, I share both the befuddlement and ambivalence, right? So I'm not speaking from any position that's different. But I'm thinking that there are two aspects, both in this conversation, there are aspects in both of your positions that I'd like to push back on. I mean, from a certain, I think that it's impossible not to be involved or interested in something that we can call collective or I would even say cosmological. I don't think this matter can be handled on what might be called the atomistic, so as not to say individual, because it is a matter of environment. I mean, there is no self, there isn't already, and of course, you know, Elissa, you said that. So, and I think you did very well, kind of took apart the sort of presumption of individual acts, though we all engage in them, and in a sense that even when I'm setting up, maybe too much of a sort of false dichotomy. But in any case, we're talking about a total order, whatever we're doing in dealing. I'm not talking about fixing, but in dealing, that's what you're suggesting has to be done at a cosmological level. But at that point, something else comes in. I don't think it's so easy to talk about, you know, other systems or the non-human. That makes me also uncomfortable. It always makes me uncomfortable when humans talk about the non-human, you know. I mean, I think there's always a presumption. Well, you know, humans are the ones who are identifying what is non-human. You know, even other systems, atmospheric systems. In any case, whether it is clear 100%, and there are certain geologists that doubt it, you know, that it's something that humans have created, right, entirely, or not. Because there's some people who would say that this is basically the rhythms of the planet.
No,
right?
This is not the rhythms of the
No, I'm not saying that I'm espousing this position, but you know, the planet has a history of emitting carbon dioxide at levels that are unfathomable, really, us, et cetera, et cetera. And there are some people who are, you know, a lot of the Gaia hypothesis people who are actually saying it doesn't really matter what human beings do. And you know, the Earth, this is just basically correct itself, which is just let it. So I'm not saying that I'm on their side at all. All I'm saying is that this is a human problem, and in a way, it has to be dealt with from within whatever the human is, except that has to be understood as something cosmological, which obviously involves, to a greater extent by far than has been happening, an openness to what is other. And even within the human, what is other within the human, you know, which I'd much rather try to psychoanalytically. To me, that's more interesting than trying to figure out what is other to the human. So all I'm doing here is kind of, I'm not even arguing against you guys. I'm just trying to, I'm adding more befuddlement and some ambivalence, and just simply saying that this may just be a false way, or a false, maybe a not productive way, when I hear that term too, of framing the problem.
Not reproductive way.
Yeah. So, you know.
I too am very suspicious about talking about the non-human in general. And I like what you said about the non-human in the human rather than the other to the human. But I do think, like, again, the thing that I'm trying to get at is the cosmological system that we're talking about is one that, like, changes contingency, when it changes causal relationships. And those causal relations involve interactions between human and non-human agents at every point. And so let's say the reduction of biodiversity in the insect population, I mean, on the same week, because whenever like this week, there was the story about the UN report, which has gotten press, but also the 97% decrease of insects on windshield. Do you read that? That, like, we don't actually know which set of these events is going to be the thing that will trigger the next thing, like the next pandemic. So, I mean, I'm not speaking for the non-human world. I'm just saying that the way that humans are affected and affect involve systems that include the Gulf Stream, the polar ice caps, and I'm not, endowing them with subjectivity. I'm just saying that what has to get taken in is something about the interrelatedness of the system itself, and that the web of that cosmology is become, and here, that is what is unprecedented. And so in answer to what you're saying, yes, humans have been destroying our environment and ourselves forever. The difference here is speed and capacity. And in abandoning speed, scale, and capacity. And if we think like Walter Benjamin, there comes a point where a difference in quantity becomes a different in quantity. And so we really are in unprecedented territory. And this is the place to use that word, unprecedented. And it really is now, like, again, we don't know where that began, where that speed cycle began. But the only thing I know about speed is that it's a system that the faster it goes, and the more it spins out. And that's what I spend my time thinking about, is how to describe that system. And it's that where every single event has a sub-event that then will engage wind and seed and red knots and insects. So I'm not speaking on behalf of them, saying, right. Oh, gee, like I'm going to speak for the I'm not one of those oohs.
Yeah, thank you. Adele, you're going to say something.
Oh, no, I'm just leaving the word.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No, actually, I do want to say something. I want to thank you for the talk. It's very, very thought-provoking. And I had some thoughts. The whole thing about the killing of the next generation, we know this from classical tragedy. We also know the notion of the earth as both mother and father to the human race, which is mythology is imbued with that. And I found myself thinking about Oedipus, whose parents left him to die, and who was raised by people who were not his parents. And he goes to an oracle, and the oracle tells him of his terrible fate, catastrophic, right? And how he then believes that he could somehow elude that fate, that he could somehow change fate by will. And then he goes and he kills a man that's about the age of his father would be, without worrying that maybe he's killing his father. He knows that the man who raised him was not his father. I.e., the whole idea that
he doesn't know that. He doesn't know that when he goes.
Yeah,
he doesn't know that.
He doesn't know that.
He believes that because he was just sent off to this other place, so he has.
But he had been told that his parents were not his parents.
Not till later. That's it.
Tiresias tells him, but yeah, he doesn't know.
I'm a little bit confused.
Oh well, there is an oracle. That's why he leaves. That's why he leaves. That is true, but he doesn't believe that. That's somebody else reporting that. He's told at a dinner table, like
it's a rumor.
It's a rumor.
Right, it's a rumor. Still, there are many incidents where Oedipus should have known better, right? And yet he persists. in not knowing. I mean, this is Ellicott, and others have written about this. And then he essentially brings a curse. I mean, he's cursed. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that it seems to me that when people talk about unprecedented disaster, and I agree with Scott this completely, that in a way this is very natural. Human beings are doing what is natural to us, which is to destroy. We destroy our fathers and mothers, we destroy the earth as a father and mother, we destroy the future generation as our children, and this is what we do. So in a way, the way I think about this is that it's entirely natural. And that what people have done is to say, yes, but it's not happening now. Or it's happening, well, yeah, maybe it's happening faster, but the consequences are downstream, so it's not going to affect me. It'll affect other generations, but not me. And of course, the more narcissistic the situation, the better able somebody is to say that. The more somebody is not able to care. I'm one of those people that's fortunate enough to have moved to the country where we still have snow. And my neighbors are NYU professors in the same category. And one of them is completely obsessed with climate change and weeps when we go for walks. She weeps about the world that our children will face. I know other people who are really not concerned at all about climate change. They know about it, and yes, it's terrible, they think, but it's very cognitive, it's very detached, it's dissociated, because it's not involving them. By the time the worst thing happens, they'll be dead. And their kids, well, they have grit. They'll figure out a way. So I guess that's just my views on the topic.
No, you had a hand, yes,
Yeah.
please, yes, absolutely.
I just want to say thank you for your talk. I really learned a lot. When you reference foods, I was thinking of object-oriented ontology. And that's because in your epigraph, I remember Timothy Morton listed something in her objects about La Baby. And Axel Ferreira, who's also at Emory University in the philosophy department.
And in Axel Carrera, yeah.
In her latest essay, I think it was in the critical philosophy. She spoke about also Laban, which is like I guess like ethics capable of facilitating ethical relations. And I was wondering in your I'm not sure the scope of this project, if you plan on turning it to book or something. But I was wondering if you were considering or thinking about ethics in any kind of way.
Of thinking about which?
Thinking about ethics.
Ethics. I think there's, first of all, thank you for that. And Axel rocks.
Yeah.
And yeah, we're so pleased that she's joined us at Emory. So, I probably wouldn't use the term ethics because that would open up a whole thing. But I think there's an ethical dimension depending on to what I'm doing here, which has to do with the regard for the other or thinking about relations to the other or one's or even responsibility. Like what does it mean to be accountable for something that what does responsibility look like in this context? And I guess that there is an ethical dimension to the extent that I'm calling for, with the help of Jack Derrida in the background, I'm calling for the sense that we need to have a different notion of that we have to think about responsibility here, because even if there's no agency, there's no agency in a conscious, self-conscious sovereign sense, that doesn't mean that there's no responsibility, and that there is a responsibility. And this would sort of maybe be a response to Adele. Is that your name? Yes, that's what I thought. I know who you are, but I just kind of had a moment to that sense that we kind of need to think about this and not just have it be about, even if it's cognitive, that there's an effort that has to be done that's about responsibility. I was thinking about what you were saying about Oedipus, because I've been working at the same time I've been writing about climate change. I've been writing on Antigone parallel. So we would, and there's about Antigone, whose very name means, against generation. Absolutely. And against life. And exactly. And so, and to me, actually these two papers were written like side by side, and Greta Thunberg's in both of them.
I thought about Antigone when we were talking.
Yeah, I was, in fact, I mentioned Antigone. And to me, Antigone is more in the zone that I'm talking about, more than Oedipus. And Oedipus had the luxury on some level. I mean, Oedipus has the luxury of the time of his own self-discovery. So if we're talking about the Sophocles play, it begins with the symptom, right? It begins with the curse and the plague. And then he gets to spend the entire play dealing with his denial and getting evidence and putting all of the pieces into the right narrative order. And to me, that's the nostalgic bit, that he has the time to be able to do that, that he has that there is a narrative into which denial and guilt or whatever can be fit. And to me, what is interesting, or what I'm trying to get at, is something to do with narrative time that doesn't have doesn't have the luxury of those moments. And that's what I think. I actually think that all people are dealing with that, whether they're weeping or whether they're saying it has nothing to do with me. And the weeping is not very helpful either. So I'm not, I'm not proposing that it's more of an action or more ethical to be weeping rather than to, be saying, I'm glad I have snow. But but that doesn't mean that one isn't affected.
Sorry, we have had a question from the Zoom now for some time, but I want to field that, then we'll come back to you guys. There's a question from Jenny Davis Barnett. Can you hear us?
She's in Australia.
I
think.
Hi, Jenny. Can you hear us now? She can Sarah, can you help me?
You need to unmute her microphone.
That's it. There we go.
Oh, wait, I see.
Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elissa, and thank you to Marcus as well. Yes, I am joining you from the city of Brisbane in Queensland, Australia. Thank you, Elissa. As always, your talk was extremely lucid and insightful and extremely timely. And I have a question for you about the willing denial and eradication of human knowledge. And I've been thinking with people like Lyotard recently on this question of, something like the differend, right? And then when we come to Australia, Elissa, you started your talk with the February 28th invasion of the Ukraine. And I think there might have been a little bit of an overshadow of the events in Brisbane on February 27th, which happened that morning. I woke up to see that the house that I was living in was being inundated with unprecedented levels of floodwaters. The waters in this house reached 9 feet. And on Sunday, February 27th, I had to evacuate and in an emergency crisis moment, the home that I was living in. My next door neighbors left their animals in their pens and they were left to drown. And as I sought refuge, there was news on the public radios and televisions about these unprecedented levels of floodwaters that had never been seen before, except the fact that in 2011, these same unprecedented, unthinkable levels of floodwaters had come up before, but again, they were unthinkable and unprecedented. And in the 1970s, these unprecedented and unthinkable, unforeseen events of flooding that caused the destruction and death of humans and animals alike, it just keeps happening. And the reason it happens in Brisbane in particular is because the humans have built a dam around the river. And I wonder if you have thought in your thinking with the climate change about the willing denial and destruction of forms of knowledge that lead to the destruction of the environment. And I don't want to say that I'm completely in the camp of going back to the past of forms of indigenous knowledge, for example. And here we have someone like Bruce Pascoe, whose work Dark Emu, he claims with great evidence that before colonization, indigenous systems of knowledge lived more harmoniously with the environment. Now, I'm not completely convinced that that was a better or more symbiotic relationship, but what we can see with help of someone like Lyotard is that there was a willing denial and eradication of knowledge, a form of knowledge that was perhaps better, if not great. It was in some ways more in harmony with the environment. And I just wonder if in thinking of the ecocide, and all the other types of the eradication, genocide, matricide, parricide, infanticide, are we also thinking about the eradication and willing denial of specific forms of human knowledge?
Well, thank you, Jenny. Well, first of all, let me say I'm really sorry to hear about your situation, your flood. It sounds horrific. And I'm touched that you showed up here today, given what you're living through. So nice to hear from you, and sorry for that. I haven't thought about this specifically in relation to Lyotard, but you've perhaps planted a seed. I will say that, you know, a little irresponsibility. I kind of want to say that the amount of energy it takes for humans to be in this denial structure now means that all kinds of things are being denied. And this also goes to technicity. And so I actually think that the production of ignorance and the annihilation of archives and literacy and sort of a general assault on knowledge in all genres and forms has been rather remarkable, and that may be a symptom of what I actually think that this climate thing is conditioning all forms of what can be known or not known. So I think it would possibly be related to a destruction of forms of knowledge. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at in my opening. It's a little bit stupid to be using the New York Times as one's barometer of anything, but it's just a way of sort of saying, look, here's what happens. You open up the newspaper on any given day, and I can open up today or tomorrow or the next day. And the fact that the New York Times is discovering what has already been known and forgetting it on a daily basis is already a sign of something. So thank you, Jenny, and do take care.
Please.
Thank you for coming to speak with us today. I was wondering about, like, when I think about climate change, I think one thing that I kind of like ponder about is the way that like civilization kind of puts up like certain timelines onto the individual. So like if you grow up in the Western world, you have this conception of time where, you know, after like the medieval Christian period, there's an industrial revolution, and you know, we globalize and create this kind of movement where humanity started conquering nature, and like the problems of climate change are on account of that. But I think like there's like kind of alternative like civilizational timelines, right? Like if you're a Chinese citizen, then maybe your timeline is like everything until 1911 was like an ancient, outdated dynastic system. And then, you know, finally, after like a near century kind of turmoil, your country's finally started to industrialize and raise the standard of living for people who couldn't have had that standard of living for most of your country's history. So I guess when we're talking about kind of like the way that we temporally conceptualize these narratives with regards to climate change, I was wondering, yeah, like how do you, like, what is the place of like civilizational difference in this kind of, in your thinking about like these
Well,
narratives?
first of all, thank you for that question. And you reminded me that I did want to, because it ties to what Jenny just said. And I think Jenny just asked about whether, you know, what I thought about Indigenous people, different and different, like not that all Indigenous people are the same Indigenous people. There are certainly many Indigenous cultures who have lived more in harmony with the environment. And that's part of those cultures. What I would say to you is I kind of feel like all of those, I feel like all of those, and this gets to the massification thing, I don't know if this is right or not, but I think that I'm going to say something really crazy, which is I sort of think that all of those very specific historical narratives are kind of over for everybody.
Yeah.
So that would be true for Chinese history going backwards up to a certain point. But once you're in a global catastrophic disaster, and I think that we kind of learned this through the pandemic, is that if something happens over here, I mean, virality is such that there are no more, that those histories are not culturally determined or cordoned off in the way that they were for many centuries. So I actually do believe that there were huge cultural differences to the temporal story of how history got told, whether you're telling it, you know, from a European perspective, or from an African perspective, or from a Chinese perspective, and that was part of human historical narratives, and that those narratives were different. And I think that those narratives can continue, but at a certain point, the floods, the waters, the viruses, the germs are such that there will be an interruption in the specificity of those narratives, and that those days are over, basically, is what I'm saying. That whatever narratives of history we have are going to be stitched together differently, because and even I'm going to go out on a limb and say, because I'm here talking about things I know nothing about. I mean, like even the notion of what a world war looks like is not going to be the same kind of world war that we, like World War I, World War II, or what a world war would be. But the world in the world war isn't the same world.
So if I may throw another one of these things here, a couple of weeks ago, we mentioned Adi Ophir, who is a wonderful thinker, was mentioning in passing. There was the discussion about the end of the world. It was certainly this kind of discussion, and he was doing something on a biblical theme, and he said, you realize let's think of course, the flood myth, and it's not just a biblical version. There are so many civilizations with flood myths. That to give you an idea that this peculiar animal, the human animal, has been contemplating the end of the world since it is imagining it.
Yeah.
Right. And insofar as it's imagining it, obviously now thinking in Freudian terms, something's happening in the psyche. What is? Not only is it an animal that destroys its environment, but it's an animal that imagines the complete end of everything. Now, why that is, etc., I'm not going to say, and I don't know, but there's something to this. It's not just a contemporary thing. What might be different is, and I don't even know if that's true also, that there is a certain physics that we now know to this complete destruction, which may play another game in the psyche. And so on. But it's interesting when the moment he said that, then everything gets relativized, including narratives of civilization, but also narratives of the contemporary.
Yeah, I mean, although those narratives are all about what happens after. So it's about the end and then the sequel.
Regeneration. Yes, rebirth, regeneration.
Right.
Of course, that might be easier to explain, but the destruction is also imagined. You have to imagine destruction in order to engage in the wish and desire for regeneration.
That's what.
So there is. I don't. I'm just. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, you mentioned at some point that destruction is so colossal to you that it sort of remains verges of unthinkable. The relation between destruction and the psyche, the concept that he used is death drive. So in a sense, death drive remains unthinkable here. However, the relation between that and the other thing you said, the way the word unprecedented was illustrated tonight, there is something in the past. There is a pastness to all this. Climate science started like that. Can have deep history or more recent one. If that's the case, and the destruction is so colossal, there must be something new in this thing, on top of this really deep pastness. So, I mean, if you accept that, then it's hard to think that human beings are driving the car towards death deliberately, unless in movies. There must be some, whatever,
Satisfaction or
yes,
pleasure.
Which is life.
Can I just
think maybe death drive shows itself for the first time in the form of this massive, the drive to have satisfaction in life shows itself in the form of this. Death drive is nothing but the form that it takes under, like you said.
can I just like try to correct something of that I'm trying to say. I did say colossal, but colossal is the wrong word for it, because I do think we have myths and we have images of total destruction, and that's a fantasy of power, right? That's a fantasy of agency, that you can blow up, that there is even a consciousness that could imagine a flood or the end. The thing that I'm claiming is unthinkable, and this was perhaps not clear enough, is the shift in what I'm claiming between contingency and causality. And that to me is the central insight that I wanted to get at, which is that what's colossal is the unpredictability. And that unpredictability, so that if you can imagine a big boom, if you can imagine like with your wish, which is in there, that you can destroy the world or something, that I think goes to the heart of humans that love this all, like that could even imagine having the power to blow up the system. But what I think is new here is the speed of things that that would have been let's say, and this gets back to what you were saying about like there's a homeostatic system. So within the Earth system that you could have a chance event, but the chance event might have a chance to correct itself over here. But what we have is a set of contingent events that then, like partly because of technology, that are setting off other cascading events.
Which is not a psychic event, no?
No, it's not a psychic
So
event.
it's doesn't have time. It's like
It doesn't have
unconscious.
time. So the psyche cannot process, I mean, even actuarial science cannot process the amount of variables that it takes to see what will be stable and what will not be stable, because part of the trauma is stability as well. Is that you actually don't know at which point something, and you know, we've been, knock on wood, we've been relatively lucky with COVID. But if you think about how sort of quickly that went, of let's say from what it started to the last 2 years, and you know, we've been lucky and there's been devastation, but it's compared to what I'm saying is of how one system is going to connect with another system now, that speed, I just do not think that in, let's say, in the Anthropocene, we've dealt with. In deep geological time, maybe, but I'm not in the business of talking about like what life was like for the dinosaurs, or you know, when they had their issues. And I still want to say that I actually think that the technological inputs, and we could talk about the Gaia people here too, and the technological inputs are such that there are too many variables that are affecting the system all the time. And that was not, I'm not actually certain that the quote unquote natural world in its own homeostatic way ever produced those kinds of variables. So that is what is unthinkable. And to me, it wasn't the colossalness isn't total destruction. It's imperceptible changes that could be cataclysmic or not, that are catalytic and that are having kind of sub-events.
Wouldn't that be described
As a form of life? What?
as the psychic event by itself?
Yes. Yes, that is a psychic event, but a psychic event still processes. I mean, if it doesn't.
Consciousness isn't process.
No, but I mean, what I'm saying is, getting back to trauma, like if you actually, if an event is so overwhelming, it will burn out the system and just produce a pure repetition, and other things will form crusts that have reaction formations and different symptoms. And
No,
Sorry, because I just want to make sure that.
you were done? Did I
this person
interrupt you?
asked this question. No. Yes, please.
Yeah, I know we're probably all tired.
No, please. We have 10 minutes and we're.
I'm just trying to think through so much that you've given us. Somebody said, okay, so what is done cannot be undone, and it made me think of then what's at stake, kind of undoing what is yet to be done at this point. So if you don't want to go down the path of sort of calculating everything in order to then undo it, it seems that what you're looking for is kind of reversing the temporality of melancholia. Kind of there's a melancholia of the future that we need to begin to mourn.
Something like that. I think that, yeah.
How do we mourn the future? Some memory of the future.
Yeah, I actually think
So-
I really like what you're saying.
And so, yeah, but this is the thing though, is I've been thinking about mourning and melancholy for some time, actually through antiquity. But it seems that maybe this is the wrong reading of Freud, but there is a linearity in Freud's distinction between mourning and melancholy, as if we have to let go in mourning rather than.
Mourning
holding
comes
on.
to an end.
Right. Right, so, but then if we are to mourn the future, as in let it go entirely, this would also be another repetition, or it would find itself in this cycle of denial in some way. So there, I don't know, I want to ask a question as a psychoanalyst, is there a way of?
I'm not a practicing
Oh,
psychologist.
okay.
There are plenty in the room, but not me.
So in psychoanalysis, I mean, is there a way of mourning the future, but also holding on to it?
Well, I think that what you're getting to, that what I'm trying to get at, which is that we need another kind of a future. So the future that has to be mourned is one that would be repaired. Like when we'll have to deal with a kind of, I mean, I don't know how else to put it, but a damaged future, or a future that is like not holding out the promise that it's all going to be okay. And so that will take some mourning. I don't exactly know how this is going to work. Yes, what did you want to say?
I like your question, how do we want the future? Because I was thinking about it, I don't know in terms of what you were thinking or not in opposite ways, but you did mention the unthinkability plenty of times, and I was wondering, are we already mourning the future in the way that we're mourning unthinkability? Or like, I guess not really mourning, but like, I guess fetishizing unthinkability, fetishizing like the unknown or what's to come, or something that isn't possible, but kind of like trying to materialize it in a certain way. And yeah, that was just like something that I was wondering if you had thought about.
I think there are endless possibilities of fetishizing the future,
Yeah.
or and I do think that unthinkability, you know, I do think unthinkability can be invoked, how can I put this, sort of cheaply or not. And to me, what I was trying to say by that term was, and I may not have done it yet, was to be getting at this thing, you know, that we've been talking about, which to get at what is it in this phenomenon that psychoanalysis can grapple with in a way that only psychoanalysis could speak to this. And so that there are plenty of climate scientists out there, and I admire them, and there are political people out there, and I admire them. So there are huge, like, different kinds of experts thinking about these issues all the time, and writing these reports like the ones I was citing. But what motivated me to get started on this was the sense that psychoanalysis really has a place in this conversation. And and the unthinkability to me was linked with denial. So, and rather than the death, I mean, that, and to me, it's that psychoanalysis, like there, you know, Freud has like 4 different terms in German for different kinds of denial. And I kind of was feeling like we need a 5th one. We need a new word for denial, like for this particular case. But that psychoanalysis, and really, like, again, the 3 things that I feel pretty confident about what I wanted to say was that I was seeing out there in the world the sense that that when people talk about denial, they would talk about it as if there was an already formed person who then started, like, who was then succumbed to denial, as if, as I said, as if there was a subject for whom denial befell. And to me, it seems really important that denial comes first. And that because denial comes first, there is, as I put it, a new fragility or a new vulnerability about shared realities, or and that's what I wanted to explore. And that's what I'm calling unthinkability. But I also think, so that's one motivation. And then the other thing was to say that the temporal structures here are part of what is testing the psyche. And I mean, at the most base level, I wanted to say in kind of an old school Freudian way, like almost eco-psychological, what does reality testing look like if reality isn't there?
Right.
Like really, like because you only go into like reality, and that's why we all have different realities too, because there's psychic reality which corresponds to reality, but all of us, you know, you have dinner with your friend and you think, oh my God, they live in a different world on the most minor things. And that fact is a psychoanalytic insight. And that is what I don't think like popular culture or science discourse doesn't share that. And I really wanted to take that to the sort of to the end of the road and sit there and say, what happens if we can't test it? Because you test it and your hand just falls right through.
We have one more question from Zoom. Can we take it?
It's up to you. Yeah.
It's up to you. But yes. So, Bazuli Deb, can you hear me? You can ask your question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. I learned a lot from it. I am not from the field of psychoanalysis, but I do work on climate change. And I really need your input for what is happening to the understanding of differential realities at the level of COP, at COP 2021 COP meeting in Glasgow. There was this conversation about coal, and my understanding is the responsibility of climate change is being put on the shoulders of the poorest of the poor in the global south, who have the smallest of carbon footprints. Everyone can't go solar. They can't afford solar. They can't make the transition. No one is giving them the solution. But then, the global elites from the north and the south are kind of, hand in gloves with each other, and will compel them to, go off coal. And what are they going to eat? And my question to you is, what, from your disciplinary perspective, is it just hubris, or is it cognitive damage under empire? Or is it absolute lack of empathy? Is it narcissism? What is it that the representatives at the COP meetings are just thinking from this kind of point of view?
I totally hear you. And I think that's massive denial, because I think they're treating climate change as if it was an old school political problem that empire could crush, and that the rich and capitalists could just like squash the poor countries like a bug, crush them like a, and I think that that's the sign that the very place that should be dealing with the politics of climate change is completely dissociated and out of touch, because that feels to me like old school strong arm politics in a zone that those gestures cannot work. But like, I mean, I don't know what kind of an answer that is, but that feels to me like, what are you doing? What are you talking about? Obviously, I mean, so I hear you, and I think I hear you, and I basically am saying that the people who were empowered to be supposedly talking about the problem were not talking about the problem.
So you see it as a denial rather than like any kind of real cognitive damage. Because
it's the denial, because it's basically, promoting the status quo, sovereign nation states, empires, and global power systems. It's acting as if the status quo of political strong arming can be a relevant way to proceed.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, and good luck.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Elissa, for this very provocative some thoughts. I think that we had a very lovely conversation. Marcus, thank you all for your intervention.
Thank you.
Elissa. And welcome back to the real world, as it were, at the university. Okay.
So, thank you all. I heard you. Did I hear you?
Yeah.